The Panasonic Lumix GH7 checks literally every single box you could ever want in a modern camera as a wedding filmmaker. If you want that feature, it's in this camera. It's insane. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the GH7 from the perspective of a wedding and professional filmmaker, because the GH series of cameras has always been so loved by wedding filmmakers for so long as a high quality and affordable option for filmmaking. So if you film weddings or corporate or commercial videos or documentaries, etc., this is the review for you. To be clear though, this is just an early review because I've only had several days to use this camera, and I'm sure there may be things that I've missed. So please watch more reviews than just mine if you're thinking about buying this camera. Also, for the sake of ethics, I want you to know this video is not paid or sponsored by Panasonic. The GH7 is on loan from them, and I will return it whenever they ask for it. Regardless, Panasonic has no say in this video, and they aren't seeing it before it's posted. In addition, I'm planning on making a much more in-depth guide for how to use the GH7 for filmmaking, and if you want to see this guide, I would be happy to send you an email when it's ready. You can sign up for my email list down at the link in the video description. On to this GH7 early review. Like I said, this is easily the most feature-packed camera that I have ever reviewed. To start, this camera builds upon the success of other legendary cameras like the GH5 and to a slightly less degree, the GH6, which I say is to a lesser degree because I remember there not being nearly as much hype around the GH6 as there was the GH5. And if I had to guess one reason for why that is, it would be that the GH6 was still using Panasonic's older, contrast-based autofocus at a time whenever their full-frame cameras that they had recently announced and gotten a lot of hype over were about to switch to using phase-detect autofocus, which is significantly more accurate. So right off the bat, I'm pleased to tell you that the GH7 has a brand new backside illuminated sensor that supports phase-detect autofocus, and this is Panasonic's best implementation to date. It works very well. Plus it can now recognize not only people, animals, cars, and motorcycles, but it can also recognize trains and airplanes too. So if you've been using the GH series of cameras and you're wanting an upgrade with better autofocus, this is the camera to buy. That said, as great as the autofocus is, there is one con that I could find, and that is that this autofocus does not work when filming at 300 FPS VFR, which yes, this camera does do 300 FPS, and in addition, while autofocus will work at 120 FPS, face detect will not work. Keep that in mind if you are filming at high frame rates. So I think there's still some room for improvement in the area of autofocus support for higher frame rates, but once the camera locks onto a face, for example, it will stay locked onto it, which is great. And compared to the old contrast-based autofocus that was all you got on the GH5 and GH6, this is dramatically better. In addition, I think that's really important to note that this camera is micro four thirds, meaning that it has a smaller micro four thirds sensor and it takes micro four thirds lenses. This is important, not only because fractions are confusing and what the heck is four thirds, but also because I'm always seeing and hearing rumors that Panasonic is going to abandon this line of cameras and sensors and switch to only their full frame line of cameras. But that's not the case. You can think of the GH7 as almost a line in the sand from Panasonic saying, no, we're in this for the long haul, baby. If you want the best video camera in the micro four thirds ecosystem, we're going to make it. And boy, did they make it. Remember, this camera checks all of the boxes. Talking build quality now. If you've used previous GH series cameras, this is going to feel very familiar to you. The GH7 is comfortable to hold with great ergonomics. You have all of the buttons that you would expect, including a dedicated red record button that pops out. It looks so good on the camera. And drawing your attention to the back of the camera now, I want you to check out the screen. And to be clear, if you've already used the GH6, this will not be anything new to you, but hey, I'm coming from the GH5 and it's pretty darn revolutionary. Panasonic took a page from the S1H and put what is, in my opinion, the best type of screen on the back of this camera, because it is a hybrid screen that not only flips out so you can see yourself whenever you're filming, but you also get all of the tilt controls that you would expect from a non-flip out screen as well. It really is the best of both worlds, and I'm so completely thrilled with it. Look, I'm someone that used a Sony a7S II for 5 years filming weddings, and I loved how compact the tilt screen was on that camera. It just was right there, it didn't flip out, and it was so nice for filming because it made the camera feel more compact. Even though I make YouTube videos and I needed to see myself to film myself, I did find myself missing the tilt screen whenever I upgraded to the a7S III. But now with the GH7, I can experience the best of both worlds. It tilts, it flips out, it does it all. Looking back at the back of the GH7 again, what's this on the left? Yes, a slot for a fan, which means that regardless of what you are filming, no matter the resolution or frame rate, up to 60 FPS they say, and I'm sure it's going to last a long time in 120 FPS. I've not had a chance to test that yet, but don't you worry, it's getting the heat of the Texas summer, so I'm sure I'll do an overheating test at some point. Keep subscribed for that. With this fan, though, I wouldn't worry about overheating for the most part, though. And this camera, like I said, it's checking all the boxes. And if you're a wedding filmmaker or you commonly find yourself filming outdoors on hot days like I do in Texas, a camera with a fan is a great way to guarantee you that you do not deal with overheating, even on those hot outdoor wedding ceremonies. Over here on the side now, pop out the memory card door, and you will see there are 2 memory card slots, which is a great thing to see. And just like the GH6, the GH7 has 1 SD card slot and 1 CF Express Type B card slot. The reason for this is, of course, all of the high resolutions and frame rates that this camera is capable of filming, which we need to talk about right now. But before we get into these specifics, I want you to know that I've confirmed from Panasonic that you can dual record video to both of these memory card slots. And if the cards that you're using are fast enough, you can record full resolution frame rate and video to both of them. But if, for example, you're recording video that has too high of a bit rate for the SD card, as a fallback, the camera can be set up to record the full resolution video to the CF Express Type B card and a smaller proxy-sized video to the SD card. It's better than nothing, and I feel like this is the best compromise that Panasonic could be able to make to be able to offer the high frame rates and resolutions that they do with this camera, while also still supporting the very popular SD card memory format. One last very cool feature of these dual memory card slots I want you to be aware of is that there's a setting in the menu that will allow you to record the full resolution video in the flat Vlog picture profile to the CF Express Type B memory card, while also simultaneously allowing you to record a proxy file with a custom LUT applied to it to the proxy video, which means that if you're on a time crunch and you're filming a video and you need to not only record very high quality footage that you can use later, but you also need social media ready footage that's ready to edit even quicker, you're good to go because the camera is going to give you both at the same time, which is really great to see. The GH7 is checking all the boxes that you didn't even know that you wanted to be checked. Now, let's talk those frame rates, resolutions, and video quality, because this is a total doozy. To start, this sensor is capable of recording anywhere from full HD in VFR at 300 frames per second, all the way up to a maximum of 5.7K at up to 60 frames per second, all in 10-bit. Oh, and it will also do 5.8K in open gate at up to 30 frames per second too. So if you're filming a wedding and the couple's asking for vertical videos for Instagram and TikTok too, switch to this and you'll be set because the video's large enough for you to do both. But I hear you saying, Matt, the GH6 could also do 5.8K open gate at 30 FPS. I wish that the GH7 could do open gate 60 FPS. And I have good news. It can. Yes, you will have to drop the resolution from 5.7K down to 4.4K, but the GH7 will record an open gate 4:3 image at up to 60 FPS at this resolution, which is great to see as an option. Back to frame rates and resolutions, here's where things get more crazy. The GH7 can do most of these frame rates and resolutions that we just talked about also in ProRes, just like the GH6, which is great to see, especially if you want to have an even easier time editing. The only limitation that I was able to find for ProRes was that it did not support OpenGate, which means that ProRes is limited to a maximum of 5.7K at 30 frames per second, or Cinema 4K if you want to drop it down to 60 frames per second. But things aren't crazy enough because there's more, and this is arguably one of the big ones about this camera. Not the biggest in my opinion, but one of the big ones. The GH7 can also record most of these same ProRes frame rates and resolutions in ProRes Raw and ProRes Raw HQ internally. So if you want to record in Cinema 4K and RAW, you can do it, and in 5.7K RAW, you can do it too, with the only limitation that I'm seeing being a crop to the sensor when filming in RAW and Cinema 4K at 24, 30, and 60 FPS, but no crop at 5.7K. But hey, it's still internal RAW. And this is fantastic news. I feel like we are finally starting to see the floodgates open and all of these camera manufacturers are starting to allow raw internal recording in their cameras. And I was surprised and delighted to see that this camera was capable of that as well. Now that said, if I did have one complaint about the internal RAW recording of this camera, because hey, even whenever camera manufacturers give us something like internal RAW recording, we can still find something to complain about, right? Is that just me? No, you're going to be in the comments. Hopefully it'll be you too. Anyways, this specific complaint is in regards to the ProRes Raw codec that Panasonic chose to use with this camera. To be clear, this complaint isn't really directed so much at Panasonic as it is at Adobe and Blackmagic, because while it's fantastic to see that Panasonic has implemented internal ProRes RAW recording in the GH7, thank you, this is a RAW format that is woefully unsupported in 2 out of the 3 most popular video editing softwares today. I should really make another video explaining all of this too, but to quickly sum up the state of ProRes RAW support in editing software today, Blackmagic does not support it at all in DaVinci Resolve, and it unfortunately doesn't look like they have any plans to support it, considering they have their own flavor of RAW with Blackmagic RAW. They're like, buy our cameras and use that. You don't need ProRes RAW with your other camera. What are you doing? Alternatively, you have Adobe, where Premiere Pro does support ProRes RAW, where you can actually import the video clips and they're able to be played back in Premiere. But the big con is that Premiere Pro does not give you nearly the same level of control you get with other kinds of RAW. So while you can change the metadata for exposure, for example, you can't change the white balance. It's more like Premiere treats ProRes RAW video clips as regular ProRes clips, and that's a bummer. Unsurprisingly though, considering that Apple makes not only ProRes RAW, but also Final Cut, I'm happy to tell you that if you buy a GH7 and you edit in Final Cut, and you decide to film in ProRes RAW with your GH7, congratulations. Final Cut is going to recognize that you filmed in a RAW video format and give you all of the RAW controls that you would expect, like those ISO controls and those white balance controls. Please, Adobe. Like, I've told them directly. I'm like, can you guys do this here maybe? And they're like, oh yeah, we should consider that. I'm like, come on. Anyways, there is the current state of ProRes RAW support. If you film in Final Cut, you're going to love this feature of the GH7, and the rest of us that edit in DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro are going to be like that meme image of John Travolta holding our jacket, looking around wondering, can someone give us better ProRes RAW support? Hello, maybe? Back to the GH7. Are you seeing now why they had to include a CF Express Type B memory card slot in this camera? An SD wouldn't cut it. Type B is the only fast enough card out there to support recording these frame rates and resolutions, especially in RAW. But I have good news for you. I'm sure you may be concerned about the price of CF Express Type B memory cards, but there's no need to stress because the GH7 also supports recording directly to an external SSD via the USB-C port. Yeah, it's right here on the side next to the full-size HDMI port, which is also great to see. And side note, you can record RAW externally using the HDMI port. Nice feature to have, but let's focus on the USB-C because you plug an SSD into this USB-C port and you can use an SSD up to 2 terabytes in size at the time of making this video to record all of your footage that's up to 60 FPS to the SSD, which will not only save you time, but is significantly cheaper as well. I'm looking forward to testing this feature more in the future. Now, we're not done talking about revolutionary stuff like internal RAW video recording because there's actually one other revolutionary thing about this camera, and it's a feature that no other camera from literally any camera manufacturer at the time of making this video has in their camera. Are you intrigued? I told you, internal RAW is not the headline feature to me, but this one is. Because I know that whenever they told me this, my jaw was literally dropped. I was salivating. I'm like, are you seriously? You putting this in a camera? Holy crap, that's amazing. Okay? As someone who cares about audio a lot, and I have a lot of audio tutorials on my YouTube channel. I'm selling audio cables with Condor Blue. I care about audio a lot, okay? I am so excited to tell you that the GH7 supports up to 4 channels of 32-bit float audio recording at up to 96 kilohertz natively in camera. Yes, if you use Panasonic's DMW XLR2 accessory. Yes, this is the first camera that supports 32-bit float audio internally, and if you do not know what 32-bit float is or why it's so revolutionary, 32-bit float audio is to audio what RAW video is to video. With 32-bit float audio, you have a ton more latitude to adjust the volume of your audio. So if it's clipping and too loud, you can bring the audio levels down and still recover them, and if it's too quiet, you can bring the audio levels up without introducing noise. Now, up until this point, 32-bit float recording has been available in audio recorders that are completely standalone, like the Zoom F3 and Tascam X8, but not in an actual camera, which meant that if you wanted to synchronize your 32-bit float audio and video, you would have to use your editing software to do it, because you would have a separate audio file and a separate video file, and you had to merge them together, and you usually use the waveforms or timecode, and it was kind of a pain. But what's great about the GH7 is that you're not going to need to do this anymore because the audio and video are going to be synchronized into one file in camera. Yes! So excited about this. That said, I do have one caveat to tell you about this new 32-bit float audio recording feature that I mentioned earlier, and that is that to properly use it, you're going to need to use Panasonic's separate audio input, which is the DMW XLR2 audio accessory that slides into the hot shoe right here, locks into place, and is going to then be powered and connected and send all the audio data through the hot shoe here. Unfortunately, you are not going to be able to just plug a microphone into the microphone jack on the camera and record 32-bit float audio right here, which, I mean, it's a great little mic jack, right? It looks great. Doesn't support 32-bit float though. You are going to have to run it through this separate accessory, which is also going to give you 2 XLR inputs, nice to see, and 1 3.5 millimeter microphone input. So if you were thinking, Matt, this mic jack down here is useless, yeah, it is kind of useless. Don't use it. Use this one up here so you get 32-bit float audio, okay? Regardless, the great news is that you can literally plug an XLR shotgun mic into this accessory, mount it right here on the mounting point, and it will record audio through the camera's hot shoe without you needing to run an extra mic jack down to the 3.5 millimeter mic jack here. And the audio that is recorded along with the camera's audio file will be 32-bit float. Hello, this is an audio test, and I'm running a Sony shotgun microphone into the Lumix XLR adapter, which I realize that's some brand cross-pollination there, but that's the mic that I had laying around. Okay, so that's what we're using here. Running that into the Lumix GH7, and it is recording in 32-bit float audio. And here's an example of how it sounds. Now for weddings in particular, don't get rid of your standalone 32-bit float audio recorder like your Tascam X8 or Zoom F3 or something like that. You're still going to want those unless you want to run a really long XLR cable across the venue's reception room to your camera and hope nobody trips on it. No, you're still going to want a separate audio recorder to plug into the DJ or venue's soundboard. Also, speaking of cables, I know I mentioned them earlier, I want you to know that my Who Is Matt audio pack of cables that I made in collaboration with Condor Blue works fantastically with the GH7's XLR inputs here. I've tested them, or any other audio recorders for that matter, and I will link to that audio pack down in the video description. Speaking of cables, again, this camera does come with another cable in the box, and this will be really interesting to you if you use Timecode, because this is a BNC conversion cable for Timecode. I believe this cable was also included with the previous GH series cameras, but it's great to see it available here, because in my experience, Timecode is just getting more popular, and especially if you're filming a wedding or another event where you have a lot of microphones, having built-in Timecode support in camera is fantastic. I'm telling you, the audio suite of the GH7, I want this to be in every single camera. There's a dedicated audio button. You press and you can see all your audio settings. It's beautiful. I love it. Next, let's talk battery life. In my testing, the battery on the GH7 lasted for about 1 hour and 10 minutes when recording in 5.7K H.265 at 24 FPS, which isn't bad, but it's still a far cry from the legendary battery life of something like the GH5. Unfortunately, we saw this battery life drop with the GH6, and it's looking like this is the new normal with the GH7. Thankfully, when I tested recording in the lower 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution, still at H.265, that performed better with 1 hour and 33 minutes of battery life. So you can expect about 20 more minutes if you don't go for the full fat 5.7K resolution recording. This is still not nearly as good as the 2+ hours of battery life you could expect from the GH5, but if you're filming a wedding, you should be able to get through the day with a few batteries with the GH7, which is still quite decent. What's also great is something you probably already expect to be great if you've used any Sony camera since the GH5, and that is in-body image stabilization. The IBIS is excellent on the GH7. You get an active mode to boost it with electronic stabilization as well. It's super smooth, and I'm not saying that you should throw away your gimbal, but you have a ton of versatility here if you want to film handheld and incorporate a bit of motion without having to break out the gimbal, and it's just great to see. Every camera needs IBIS this good. It's magical. Now, let's talk about something that I was a bit worried about now, though, and mentioning the GH5 again, you'll know that one of my biggest criticisms of that camera was the low light performance. I spend a long time complaining about that in my review, because if you're a wedding filmmaker, you will undoubtedly know that weddings are one of the most challenging scenarios to film in whenever it comes to light. You rarely have full control over your lighting, and that's where a camera that can hit higher ISOs is so important, because even if you bring lights, you may not have time to set them up, or you may not be able to, etc. Well, here we are, many years after the GH5 and 2 generations later, and I'm happy to tell you that while the low light performance isn't as good as, say, a full-frame camera like the A7S III, it is still significantly better than the GH5, especially considering this is a much smaller than full-frame micro four thirds sensor. So Panasonic is really doing some magic to get the low light performance to look as good as it does. Now, the first thing you need to know is that this is a brand new backside illuminated sensor from Panasonic. So if you're coming from the GH5 or GH6, the GH7 should be better in low light than both of those cameras due to this sensor design. Side note, by the way, you can decrease the ISO lower than 500 if you enable the extended ISO mode in the camera's menu, but I haven't tested this to see if it drops the camera's dynamic range like it does on my Sony A7S III, for example, so this is something to keep in mind. Like I said though, the GH7 is still noticeably improved from the GH5 when it comes to noise, because I remember with that camera, I was terrified to go even above ISO 1600, with the highest that I could even ever recommend being 3200 due to the high level of noise that would appear very quickly. It even led me to recommending that if you filmed a wedding with the GH5, to film the first half of the wedding day that was well lit with that camera, then switch to a full-frame camera like an A7S II for the reception because it was so much better in low light. Thankfully, with the GH7, I would feel comfortable saying that you can go up to much higher ISOs than the GH5, let's say to about 6400 to 8000 without introducing too much noise, so this is definitely improvement. To be clear, the GH7 still maxes out at only ISO 12800, which also happens to be the second dual gain ISO level of the A7S III, where that camera has the least noise, so hopefully that helps put in perspective just how great the A7S III is for low light. But that camera is also significantly more expensive than the GH7 and doesn't have some of its features like internal recording, or as good of IBIS, or 32-bit float internal. There's a lot of features in the GH7, okay? It's pretty darn fantastic. I'm telling you, checking all the boxes here. Also, last thing I will say in regards to low light with the GH7, I want you to know that I've only tested the low light performance of this camera with a lens that had a maximum aperture of f2.8. But micro four thirds is great because it supports many lenses that have much lower apertures like f1.4, f1.2, or f.95. And there's a lot of math there involved, converting from micro four thirds to full frame camera size and then the physics of light going in. My main point, though, is that if you invest in other lenses, you can find yourself getting dramatically better low light performance. In addition, you can also negate many of the laws of physics in regards to how the GH7 struggles with its sensor size compared to full frame if you choose to purchase a speed booster to use with this camera as well. A speed booster will give you a huge boost, literally, to the width of your lenses and will also dramatically improve the low light performance of the camera even more. So my point is that I tested the GH7 with a relatively average lens and no speed booster, and I still thought the low light performance wasn't bad, and there are definitely ways to significantly improve it. So I would not immediately write off the GH7 due to it not being full frame, because you can work around a lot of these noise limitations from the smaller sensor very easily. I think you'll be perfectly fine using this camera to film a wedding, especially if you want to pair it with some brighter glass and maybe a speed booster, and of course bring lights. You should always bring lights regardless of the camera that you're using or what you're filming. Just always have lights, okay? Now, speaking about ISO and really image quality more, because we haven't really addressed that a ton, the first thing you need to know is that in my testing, the colors from the GH7 look fantastic, and the footage from this camera looks really great. I'm very, very impressed by it. I also want to take a moment to talk about dynamic range, because while I'm not doing any in-depth test here with a Xyla chart or anything like that, I want you to know that this camera, of course, supports filming in the flatter V-Log picture profile, which will give you a great dynamic range of about 13 plus stops according to Panasonic. And in addition, Panasonic has also included all of the new LUT features that we saw from the Panasonic S9, just without a dedicated LUT button on the camera. You're not going to find that here. You can access the real-time LUT feature. You can use the Lumix Lab app to create your own LUTs and transfer them to and from the camera wirelessly and store up to 39 LUTs on camera. You can combine two LUTs at the same time and adjust their opacity. There's a ton of features here from the S9, and I'm so glad to see Panasonic put them in a camera that's more focused on filmmaking, and it's really great. Panasonic's the only company giving you this level of control in regards to color in camera, and it's amazing. Side note, by the way, if you want some LUTs that look incredible and work fantastically with the GH7 or any other camera for that matter, I've tested them, I would love for you to check out my Who Is Matt LUTs, which I'll link to down in the video description. While we are talking apps and wireless capabilities too, I know we just talked about transferring LUTs wirelessly to the camera. I also want you to know that GH7 supports frame.io integration, so you can upload your video clips to the cloud right as you're filming them. But what's more interesting to me as a wedding filmmaker is the camera's internal support of live streaming directly from the camera. You can tether the GH7 to your smartphone or laptop and stream to the internet, and if you're, say, filming a wedding and the couple wants their ceremony live streamed, the GH7 is going to offer you a really streamlined way to do that. I have not had time to test this feature in depth yet to see how rock solid it is, but regardless, I think it's a really great feature to have. Also, whenever Panasonic announced this camera, they also shared a big surprise with it, that they have collaborated with Arri to license the Arri Log C3 profile from their Alexa cameras and bring that to the GH7 and GH6 as well. And you can enable this log profile if you pay a $200 licensing fee. I have not had time to test this profile in depth yet, but as you can see, this Arri Log C3 profile is really cool. And while I wouldn't say it turns your GH7 into an Alexa necessarily, if you are someone that's already filming with an Alexa and you want to be able to easily match it, you can now do that with the GH7. In addition, this Arri Log feature also gives you access to Arri's look library with LUTs that are custom tuned for that log picture profile. And remember, the GH7 supports up to 39 internal LUTs, so I can think of no better way other than putting my own Who Is Matt LUTs in there than to also put Arri's LUTs on this camera and have them work with this Arri Log profile. It's pretty cool. Back to picture profiles and dynamic range. Now we need to talk about another feature called Dynamic Range Boost, which was a feature that you could enable in the menu on the GH6 too, as the name implies, to boost the camera's dynamic range by essentially having the camera record a darker image and a brighter image and merging them together to give you better detail in your shadows and in your highlights. The GH6's Dynamic Range Boost feature did have some compromises though. Namely, whenever you enabled it, the camera would default to a minimum ISO of 2000, which made it a bit of a pain to film on a bright and sunny day. ISO 2000 gives me flashback to earlier Sony cameras, which had your ISO cranked really high to be able to film an S-Log3, and I was like, oh, it was so hard. And then they finally brought it down to 800. And now it's more usable. Well, that brings us back to the GH7 though, and that Dynamic Range Boost feature, because whenever you open up the menu, there's no Dynamic Range Boost option. First time I was like, where is it? Is it not in here? What is happening? What? Did Panasonic remove this feature? Did they say, we don't need extra dynamic range, who cares? No. Don't worry, they did not get rid of it. Instead, they improved it. They removed that pesky 2000 ISO minimum limitation and made this dynamic range boost on by default, so it's always enabled on your GH7 if you're filming anything at up to 60 frames per second. So anything at 24 FPS, 30 FPS, 48 FPS, 60 FPS, any of those settings will have dynamic range boost enabled by default, and if you opt to go beyond 60 FPS to 120 frames per second to 4300, etc., that is when Dynamic Range Boost is going to turn off. Now, if you're wondering how much dynamic range you will get with the boost on and off, Panasonic says with Dynamic Range Boost, you can expect to get over 13 stops of dynamic range, and with it off, you can still expect over 12 stops. Like I said, though, I haven't done any in-depth dynamic range tests, but to my eye, I can confirm that the dynamic range does look quite competitive with other cameras like my Sony a7S III filming in S-Log3. Overall, this is really great to see, especially from a micro 4/3 camera, and typically on a wedding day, I do not find myself filming at 120 frames per second, but if you're someone that does it often, this is something to keep in mind because you're going to have slightly less dynamic range at that frame rate. Now, back to the base ISO discussion. Again, remember, the GH6 with its dynamic range boost had a minimum ISO of 2000. With the GH7 now, though, the base ISO when filming in Vlog with dynamic range boost is now 500, which is much more usable. Now you don't have to think about whether you want to boost your dynamic range or not. It's always just enabled for most frame rates, and it's great. So as you can see, the GH7 is a really full-featured camera that literally checks all of the boxes that I basically have ever had for a modern camera with good autofocus, plus the addition of things that I always dreamt of but wasn't sure I would ever see, like 32-bit float internal recording and internal raw video all in one camera, and at a price of only $2,200. This is very competitive with other cameras, and it checks the price box as well. The quality and features are all there with the GH7, and it would make an excellent choice as an A camera, or heck, if you already have something like an S5 II, for example, and you're wanting a B or C camera that will complement it well, let's say for filming wedding ceremonies, the GH7 would be an excellent choice there as well. All that said, I do think there is one thing that many filmmakers may consider to be a con of this camera. To be clear, this is not me saying this. I don't think it's a con, but other people do, so I'm betting I'm going to hear it in the comments, and it's something that's unavoidable with the GH7, and this supposed con is the GH7 sensor is not full frame. Sorry, the GH series is still at its heart a micro four thirds camera system, which some people think is a con, but I think is a good thing. There's still a ton of micro four thirds filmmakers out there that are going to be super excited about this camera, and they're going to be so excited that they do not need to sell all their lenses and switch to a larger and more expensive full frame camera system. Micro Four Thirds offers a lot of strengths, with not only cheaper prices for the camera, but also more affordable lenses as well, and a ton of adaptable lenses. I mean, the flange distance is so small. You have a ton of lenses you can throw onto this thing with a speed booster, which is awesome. Sure, there is a crop, but I just mentioned a speed booster. Throw a speed booster on, and that's not an issue anymore. You've eliminated a lot of the crop and gotten better low light performance. And heck, I can think of plenty of situations that I've filmed, like wedding ceremonies and conferences, where having a crop sensor means that I can get away with buying a cheaper zoom lens that's still going to get me significantly closer to what I'm filming due to the 2x crop. It's a great choice for events like that. But at the same time, if you're someone that uses the Panasonic Lumix S5 II or S5 IIX or another full-frame Panasonic camera, I want to give you some hope as well. I don't want you to think that Panasonic is going to leave all these fancy new features with the GH series and never bring them to their full-frame cameras. It's not like that. Remember, because the GH series has a smaller sensor, the entire camera can be kept smaller and generate less heat. So the way that I think of the GH series is almost as a test bed, a preview of what is going to eventually arrive in Panasonic's full-frame cameras in the future. This is just an educated guess here, but you cannot tell me that Panasonic isn't working on an S5 III, which has all of the features of this camera, like internal RAW recording and 32-bit float, but in a full-frame body with an L mount on the front of it. You may have to wait a couple years, but I would bet that's coming, and that's pretty exciting. We're seeing a literal preview of the future of Panasonic's full-frame cameras in the GH7, and they're going to be pretty darn great. Speaking of pretty great, I want to tell you about another pretty great thing, and that is my free workshop that I've put together called How to Book Your First Wedding in 30 Days or Less. And this workshop is going to be super helpful to you regardless of whether you are brand new to filming weddings or you've been filming them for a while. The things that I'm going to teach you are going to be incredibly helpful to you when it comes to booking your weddings. I'll leave a link to that workshop down below, and remember, it's free. Let me also know in the comments if there's anything you'd like me to cover in my in-depth filmmaking guide for the GH7 II. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.